if you have common sense, you have to do a number of things. Now the Constitution, somewhat imperfectly, made provisions, firstly for equality, to be central to its edifice. And doesn't talk about equality, it talks about the achievement of equality. So alive to the fact that it is a progressive thing in any society. I think, and that my time is running out shortly, I'm not sure how much time I have, about 3-4 minutes, many more things I want to say. But what I want to leave you with is this idea that we are a product of, silly for use that word, of colonialism. 1882 in Berlin, people decided how they're going to dismember Africa. But earlier than that, in 1652, our countrymen came. After 360, 70 years, they're distinctly and clearly part of this continent. And lastly, to characterize the Constitution as some liberal compendium is to do a disservice to human effort over the years. Over the millennia, there are values that have crystallized, values of human decency. And we find them in a variety of protocols and conventions around the world. To attribute them to colonial masters only is to do a disservice to ourselves. We are the champions of humanism. We are the ones who've said, people are people are people. We are the ones who've rejected racism and have taken anti-racism stances. And we are the ones who ought to change our world. To summarize, we've got to fight racism. But that means embracing everybody as a human being. We can't do what apartheid finds comfort in, because we are liberators. We are the torchbearers of humanism and of equality, of goodness. And that moral torch we should always own and not surrender to some liberal notion of how the world ought to be organized. And I don't accept that. All the fundamental rights and freedoms are nothing but an iteration of liberal position. If you do that, it's to concede to Europe just about every wonderful value that we have fought for, that has been formulated in Latin America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world. And I refuse to surrender it to very weak and namby-pambish notion of neoliberalism. I think what we ought to do is to find true and real equality that 1994 did not bring. When we approach the common law and any other law, we have to infuse them with those values that are truly liberatory. That will change our lives. You can never say, I was born in sin, and therefore I will never be a better human being. I don't accept that. We should go out there and change our society. Sadly, our leaders have been a big disappointment. They steal, they lie, they're selfish, they don't attend to true project and interests of our people, and not to be that to be confused with whether or not the Constitution can be of use in the fight for liberation. I thank you.
All right. Let's see. Sorry, I just going to sort this out. I need to use my hand for something else. Can everybody still hear me? Okay, then the microphone may not be too difficult. I'll just speak up and see what we're going to do. The first thing I wanted to say is that the Constitution and the new state we have now is not simply the result of colonialism. It is the result of the struggles of our people, of the deaths of many people, of the suffering of many people, of the imprisonment of many people. And we must not forget about that and insult those people who fought for the constitution that we have now. Otherwise, we, in a sense, dehumanize ourselves and dehumanize our own struggle and do not appreciate the sacrifices of our own people. That's the first point that I wanted to make. The second is that a constitution is as good or as bad as the circumstances in which the constitution was produced. The circumstances result in the nature of the constitution. So, for example, if we had drafted our constitution 50 years ago, with the learning that was there at the time, I doubt whether we would have said that gay and lesbian people must be equal with everybody else. So the learning 50 years ago about what a constitution should contain, what societal values should contain, change as time goes along, because we do not live in a static society. We live in a society which changes and which changes all the time. The third point I wanted to make is about South African customary law. One thing that the apartheid people did, as our courts have said, is that they fossilized customary law. They took customary law as it was 50 odd years ago, the male primogenitor principles, the sexist principles, and so on, and made it into absolute law forever, and therefore stultified the development of customary law. So customary law, like all law, develops in society as society changes and as society develops. So we must not think of the customary law that is contained in the legislation which the apartheid government passed as the true customary law, because what they did was prevented the change in customary law completely and absolutely. The next point I want to make is that the Constitution depends on the balance of forces that existed at the time. So there's no such thing as an ideal constitution, and there could be no such thing as a victory as far as our struggle for democracy was concerned. Because at that time, the balance of forces was that there was some international support for us. The balance of forces was that the Nats still had their army. The balance of forces reflected that most of the land was owned by white people and they were not going to give it away. And therefore it was unrealistic to get that change. But the second part of the balance was that the people in South Africa had become ungovernable, there was no international support, and the powers that be found it impossible to govern. So it was those balance of forces which gave rise to the kind of settlement we have in the Constitution. Not a sellout, but an accurate reflection of the balance of forces that existed at that time. And you cannot have, it is impossible to have a societal compact or a contract or a constitution or a law which is other than a reflection of the circumstances of the time and the balance of forces that existed at that particular time. The next point I wanted to make is that our constitution is not a liberal constitution, as many will say. Liberalism overemphasizes freedom. Our constitution is about human dignity, equality, and freedom, balancing each other out as best as they possibly could. It is about all three things. And if you look at the cases properly, then you cannot use your freedom to cancel out human dignity, nor can you use your freedom to cancel out the notion of equality. And in my view, there is room for an interpretation that human dignity and equality is more important as a value in our Constitution than licentiousness and an absolute and utter freedom as most people in the West would have it. And that combination of dignity, equality, and freedom, and our Constitution's ability to talk about the improvement of the quality of lives of our people makes a huge difference to that definition. That combination is not accepted anywhere in the West, and I would say that it comes close. The balance between human dignity, equality, and freedom, all balancing each other out, is really very important as fundamental notions of Ubuntu as many of us understand it. So remember, it is about human dignity, equality, and freedom. Of course, our Constitution can be changed. But it must be changed constitutionally. In those days, of course, we embarked on protests and a war because there was no people way of changing the Constitution. Now there is. And the way to change it is to persuade more and more people that those who want to change the Constitution are right, that the new Constitution is good for our country in every respect, that the new Constitution is better for our country. The question is not whether you go back to your roots, whether you go back to your past, because, as I say, society changes, values change. The question is the change that we project in our Constitution, in real and practical terms, better for the kind of society we contemplate? And we must know how we're actually going to get there ultimately. The next point is that our Constitution is not silent. Oh yeah, okay, I'm reminded that to change our Constitution, we need 2/3 of the members of Parliament to agree with it. To change the Bill of Rights, we need 2/3 and something else. And to change the fundamental values of our Constitution, we need 75%. Now, what you need to understand is that this Constitution was passed by representatives of the African people of our country. But the majority of them, 62, about 75% of the people who were represented in the National Constitutional Assembly were actually African representatives of African people. And it was very different from what we had. So I'll deal with a different point, which was that we have reference to the improvement of the quality of lives of our people. We have reference there to social and economic rights, which the other side didn't want, the right to health and education and so on. And we have a very good right to property clause. And the thinking at that time was that this Constitution does not give rise to equality and non-discrimination and the abolition of poverty. What it does is that it gives us a new foundation, if you like, a new launching pad from which we can continue the struggle for the formation of the kind of society we believe in. I considered myself continuing with that struggle when I was in the Constitutional Court. The Constitution imposes upon each and every one of us the obligation to participate in the struggle to create the kind of society contemplated in our Constitution. And that is not achieved by the law alone. We must not overestimate the function of law. The courts say gay and lesbian people are equal. Many, many, many people in our society say gay and lesbian people live in sin. The courts say that men and women are equal. Many, many women in our society believe that they are inferior. Many men in our society believe that they are superior. So we've got to have, in addition to legal things, a social revolution to truly create the kind of society in which everyone is really equal. And the position has changed in our country. The thinking was that we'd be able to expropriate land and take away land from people at a cheaper rate than market value. The thinking was that having taken it away at a cheaper rate than market value, we would increase the taxes of rich people and make sure that we buy that land using the money from the taxes which we got from rich people for just an equitable compensation, not for market value. And the thinking at the time was that what would happen is that that would then trickle in and more people will get property, and the rich will pay for poor people getting property through the tax system, through a special property tax, and so on and so on. But what did the government do? They kept compensating market value. They refused to adopt the policies of the Constitution, and they slowed down change considerably. So I think, have overstayed my time. That's all I'm going to say now, and we will leave it there. But our Constitution must be studied very carefully before we reject it. Let us not talk on the absence of knowledge. Let us look at the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a whole and what it provides. And before and obviously we must discuss it, because there is life beyond the Constitution, provided we are satisfied that the route we go is the right one, that it will be better for our country in the definition of goodness as we understand it. We must go ahead. Thank you.
First, I apologize that I'm late. No. I also apologize that I don't have a microphone. Zak Yacoob took the microphone. Now we know how decisions were arrived at the Constitutional Court. The guy with the microphone took the decisions. Yeah. All right. I do have a good excuse why I was late. My friend and colleague Daniel Pofu lost his mother this morning, and I had to pay my customary respects. The question for today is, can the Constitution heal history, regulate the present, and deliver a just future? So my answer is no. Let me explain. This is not a controversial subject. I'm a constitutionalist. I'm a believer in the Constitution. But I don't think the Constitution is a Bible. And I think the Constitution must constantly be considered, must constantly be challenged, and must constantly be reconsidered. There are things that can heal history, there are things that can regulate the present, and there are things that can deliver a just future. But those things are not the Constitution. Those things perhaps are in the realm of economics, in the realm of politics, and sometimes in the realm of philosophy, but rarely in the realm of law. Now let me try and cash out my proposition at the beginning so that it's clear where I'm going. So I've been reading this book. It's called Whigs and Hunters, The Origin of the Black Act. The author is a historian, E.P. Thompson, a famous historian of the 18th century. Well, he didn't live in the 18th century, he lived in the 20th century, but his history writings were really about the 18th century in England and the rest of Europe. But what the book is about an act that we know very little about, passed in 1723 in England. And this act made it a capital offense. In other words, you would be shot and killed if you hunted a deer. You know a deer, those things with funny, exactly. So if you hunted that and you were arrested, you'd be shot and killed. The problem is it became a very controversial piece of legislation because, as you could see, those people with the land, right, and those people without the land, the people who hunted were the people without the land, and the people who were concerned about what was being hunted were the landowners. So the landowners managed to get Parliament to pass legislation that would make it a capital offense to hunt deer. In other words, to hunt for food became criminal, right? And the author of the book then takes a Marxist critique of the statute, and then he finds that the statute is ultimately a product of those people with the land, and it is a product of those people with money, and it is enforced, right, for the interests of the powerful in society. In other words, the legislature is captured, for those of you who are growing up in South Africa today. But the two important chapters are towards the end. The first one, what was the politics of the act? And then he finds that the politics of the act, but that power had shifted, right, from an egalitarian society to a capitalist society where the power really resides with the powerful. But he also then, because Thompson was a sophisticated historian, towards the end of his book, he then delivered a conclusion that startled many of his colleagues, where he said, despite everything that I have said about the law being an instrument in the hands of the rich, the rule of law is an unqualified human good. And he explained what he meant by saying the rule of law itself is an unqualified human good. He drew a distinction between the law, the words that you see, and the spirit of the law, the things you do not see, but the things that nevertheless are important in giving life to the law. So if you looked at the Constitution and you saw a piece of paper, you'd be forgiven for believing that you can't eat the piece of paper. And this is not my argument. This is a point that was made by Julius Nyerere. We should not be straitjacketed by the Constitution, he declared, because people eat land, they don't eat books. What does this mean, this chasm between land and books? Because it is a striking metaphor that he uses. It simply tells us that although we can have a framework, if we are unable to populate the framework with real meaning, I made a speech the other day about an empty rule of law. We are not interested in an empty rule of law. We are only interested in a rule of law that's interested in equality. So the idea that we are constantly told that we should be happy because we have a constitution actually doesn't make sense to many of us. The Constitution only makes sense if it guarantees its promise and if it delivers on its promise. And hence, even according to E.P. Thompson, he was able to recognize that a rule of law that focuses on narrow legalism ultimately loses legitimacy and ultimately makes no sense to the people without the land. And he was also able to recognize that the law could easily be captured so that it is an instrument in the service of the rich and the powerful. This is not a story of 1723, although it is my starting point. This is a story of 2018 in South Africa. It is not as if the Constitution has not been used. But the problem is that if you look at the ways in which it has been used on a socio-economic level, the fact of the matter is that the most effective uses of the Constitution have been in the protection of the interests of the privileged. Look at language as a case in point. No one can doubt that the most litigated cases in this country have been cases about the protection of the status of Afrikaans. And I'm glad to say this in this university in particular. Free State, Stellenbosch, they are all the same WhatsApp group. So the point is that it is possible for those people with access to resources to take a cynical view of the Constitution and use it in the protection of the interests of the privileged and in the protection of the interests of the powerful. We in South Africa are a typical example of that instance where a constitution that is designed, no doubt, that is designed to be an instrument of revolution can actually